Okay, so we are done our warp threads. As you can see, it's a whole new opening of geological time. A new epoch has begun, and it is known as the weft age. To get here, you want to make sure that when you're filling your strands in, you don't want to overlap any of the ends here. Because it's a rounded shape, it gets wider here, right? So it's more important to have everything even here than to have everything filled here, because this overlapping here is a pain to deal with and can get complicated kind of quickly. Another thing that I forgot to mention earlier is your floss or threads should be a similar weight to the item you are darning. You can also experiment with basically any type of floss or thread you've got. I really like the Selacia thread though, and I think it's the best all-purpose thing you can have, so that's why we put them in the kits. So when you start this, I actually kind of like to start somewhere close to the center and a little bit offset, just because you know you're going to have to change your thread anyway, and then you don't have to deal with all the bulkiness here. It's a little bit easier to start right here. So same as before, you're gonna start and tack your thread down and your tail, put that inside, and if you stab through your actual thread, that's usually the best way to get that nice and strong. So you want to just be able to give it a little tug and should be good. So weaving is basically just an over-under motion. I like to use the needle eye end for this part. Some people like to tack it down in parts as they go. That's really just personal preference. I like to mostly just weave it. If you do have something that has a hole, like a full hole in the center and some parts that are not whole yet, sort of like this, to keep it even and to keep your fabric laying how you want, you can tack it down as you get to those edges, and that'll just keep everything in line with each other. But usually you do want to start before you get to an actual hole. So I also recommend starting on a darn a little bit smaller than this, just that way you can have the satisfaction of finishing something like this spot right here. But I just wanted to show you guys the heel darn, just because that's such a common thing. So you just slip it over, under, over, under, and as you go, you can pull it through, and you can kind of take a quick look and like check over your work. Make sure that none of your threads are getting messed up in each other. That's also why I don't really like to tack it down at the beginning. That way you can pull it back through if you mess up, because then nothing is actually sewn into each other yet. And having this whole first line done will give us a guide on either side of what we should be doing, because you want to alternate your next line. So this one we started over, so the next line, again, you'd be starting under like that. Do the opposite. And you're basically just making your own fabric, which is pretty cool. So the reason you use the eye end is just so that you don't have that sharp needle end catching stuff, because then you end up catching the fabric underneath or your thread, and things can just get out of whack a little bit more easily. If you have a cross-stitch needle lying around at home, that also works in the same kind of way. And you just want to make sure you got all those spots right, because this is what the rest of your darn is going to be based off of. So if you mess up your first row, you kind of have to go with it. I mean, it's not the end of the world. Nothing is the end of the world when you're darning a sock, really. It's a pretty low stakes project. And I mean, as you work too, you can find things that you thought were a mess up at first, and they end up being a fun new way to do things. So one important thing is you want this line to be pretty straight. And because we did that nice box all around everything, our strands all start in about the same spot here. So you can see that I just like to do like a quick little measurement like this. So my strand starts at this point, and you put the point there and have it in a good spot to tack it down. Especially on your first one. I mean, after that you're just going right beside it, so it doesn't matter quite as much. And you want to do a little tacking stitch at the end. And you just want to make sure it's tight, but not too tight across. Then you go right next to it. And so this one went under, so we're going to start by going over. Or actually, no, this one went over, so we're going to start by going under. And the first one I find is usually easiest to like pull it all the way through, because then you're started. And if you ever get lost on where you are, just look at the row right beside you that you just finished. And you can kind of figure out what you should be doing from there. And you want to make sure you untangle these as you go so they're in the correct order. Probably seems tedious watching it, and it can be a little bit, but it starts to get pretty methodical and you can kind of even zone out and keep doing it. I definitely have watched a lot of movies and listened to a lot of podcasts while doing this, just because you can look at that line right next to you and see what you're supposed to be doing. So even if you forget where you're at, there's a nice little guide built in. And you can actually see that I messed this up right here. So that's a good chance to show. Just unthread my needle to do this rather than going through. But if you just pull your thread back out, what I did was I had accidentally flipped one of my warp strands. So they were crossing over each other and they were in the wrong order. But it's nice and easy to pull this out. This one, see, they're flipping on each other. And I think I actually did that the very first time. So what we're gonna do to fix this is we're just gonna pull this one right here because they're almost like right next to each other in the line. We just kind of fixed that by flipping them over and we're good to go. Rethread the needle and just keep going in your line. It's really common to get small little spots like that. And it's no big deal. There's lots of ways to fix it, especially early on. The earlier you catch something like that, the easier. You can just pull your thread out or you can flip it. But once you flip it, you want to keep it that direction for the rest of your darn. And I'm just pulling through entirely after each over-under motion just because I feel a little bit nervous after my last mistake. Okay, so we've got quite a bit done here now. And one thing I wanted to mention is when you're doing weaving on a loom, you usually have this wooden stick that has little divots in it, and you use that to push your threads all together. When you're weaving like this, obviously you can't, so I just like to use the little end of my needle, and as I'm going, push it up against my last set of stitches. That way when you start your next row, you'll have a nice even spot to work with. If you realize you didn't push your pieces up enough, here, we'll pull this out a little bit just so that it looks like not in quite as tight. So you go in, you push it with your end, but you can actually catch some of your fabric from underneath and go as close as you possibly can while still picking up your piece like that. And that will kind of tack your next layer of rows in closer so that holds it for you. And I find that helpful if you find that you're not getting a tight enough weave. The other thing is that if you want to go a little bit faster, you can do 2 layers, but you have to do that from the very beginning. So what you would do for that is on your warp strands like these ones, your white ones, you would do under 2 over 2, and you can get a little bit of a bigger pattern going that way. The other thing that I wanted to show before we move on is right here. You can see I have 2 stitches together, and that was from when at the beginning I had twisted my 1 row, and to fix it to make sure that everything else was still offset, I had to put 2 under. So if you look, every time I've done the 2 on these 2. These count basically as 1 strand, and that's a way to fix it if you make a small mistake like that as you're going. So when you're doing a curved piece like the heel, you end up with it getting very, very tight in here towards the edges of your piece. So you can see that there's actually no more room here and here all the way up to here to put weaving in anymore. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go in and fill in here until it's all the way full and there's no more spots with room. But that means you have to start higher and higher up. So I'm going to be actually starting weaving like here, but eventually it'll get in more and more. Oops. Tack you down. And for this part, I find it's a lot easier when it's really tight in to use the pointy end of your needle rather than the eye. Okay, so we're getting to the end now, and we're just gonna do our last few rows of stitches. You want to try to make sure that everything in here is really tight and your rows get shorter and shorter toward the end just because of the curve here. And sometimes I like to go in if there are spots that are a little bit loose and go back and do a little bit of extra filling in. You can see since I'm using the variegated floss, at this point it's actually like the same color as my main strand, which is a little bit harder to work with, or really for you guys to see, because when you go up nice and close to it yourself, it's not too bad. So this is pretty much the end here. I'm gonna go one more pass along this line. There are a couple of spots that I think can be woven in a little bit tighter, but when it's really tight at this point, you can't really weave it in and out so much as you're just sewing it down. So there's like, see, there's this one thread right here, and then after that I'm going to be done. And to finish it, you just finish your thread like you do anytime you're changing your thread. You just go in and out of the same spot essentially, and back and forth to tack it down. And one thing that I like to do is when you put your thread in and you just pull it out somewhere kind of far away and you pull tight on this, and when you snip it, it's going to be more buried inside, because as soon as you stretch that out, it's gone. And we're just going to take this off, and you can see, because we had the egg on it, stays in a nice heel shape. It looks a little bit funny when your foot isn't stretched in the rest of the sock because it comes up more, but as soon as a foot's in there and it stretches with the rest of the sock, it holds the right shape. And we'll show that from the inside as well. And you can see the spots where I had to tack it down a little bit more. Just because the fibers were extra thin here, they were like a little webbing. So I was just weaving it in and out because it was easier to catch them than to try to not catch them. And that's the basic heel darn. When you ever want to do a flatter darn, usually we'll use an embroidery hoop to get it nice and flat if it's a bigger spot. And if you are doing the toe in here and you want it to be nice and flat, I usually just stick the egg inside like this, and you want to tie it down so it's along this longer side. And that just gives you a nice spot that's nice and flat. And you can get your toe, you can use the egg in lots of different ways. You just want to make sure you think about how the fabric is going to be shaped when your garment is actually being worn, and try to mimic that shape with this handy little guy. And that's how you do the basic heel darn.